They were tied to a fence when the wind found them. 3 shapes, one broken, one defiant, one barely breathing. And when Silas Reeve rode into town, the town held its breath because silence, out here, always meant danger. They said the wind out here had a mind of its own. It slid through shutters left too long unattended, stirred curtains that hadn't seen a woman's hand in years, and scraped dust along the wooden ribs of porches where no one rocked anymore. In spring, when the earth was still thawing and the nights breathed frost, the wind became something else, a warning. Once, an old prospector named Whitaker claimed the wind could carry secrets buried beneath the town's silences. That, if you listened close. You could hear regret rattle in it like buckshot in an empty canteen. No one argued. Folks in Ashbrae Crossing knew better than to test what couldn't be tamed. That morning, in the spring of 1887, the wind rose early, strong enough to shake shutters and lift skirts. It pressed through the narrow streets of the half-faded town, like a restless animal, and at the edge of town, where the trail met the freight road and the church steeple cast its crooked shadow over the dry earth, the wind found something worth stirring. 3 shapes, bound and slumped, one tall, barely upright. 2 smaller, curled like pups, too young to understand what they'd done wrong. They were tied to the old freight post, just past the shuttered doors of what used to be the Overland Station's storehouse. It wasn't the first time shame had been nailed to that fence, but it might have been the first time it looked back. Silas Reeve didn't ride in with drama. His wagon wheels turned slow. His reins were held loose in his left hand. The right rested on his thigh, still and scarred, like the rest of him. A bundle of feed sacks lay behind him, along with a canvas tarp covering seed and saddle oil. His coat woolen, thick, too warm for the season, was worn buttoned high, as always, hiding the melted skin along the left side of his neck. No one asked about it anymore. He came in like thunder over distant hills, quiet, but certain. The moment his boots hit earth, the town seemed to still. The wind bent sideways. No one stepped out to help. Not the clerk at Holloway's feed, not Miss Mercy Claggart, who stood on her porch with a basket of church linens, eyes narrow and mouth thinner still. Silas walked to the fence without a word. The boy, older, maybe 12, stared back with fury caked behind the bruises. His wrists were raw. The smaller one beside him, all knobby knees and trembling chin, looked away. Silas reached into his coat, drew out a pocket knife, and knelt. The blade made a quiet shick as it cut through the first knot. The older boy swayed, knees buckling, but Silas caught him with one hand and steadied him. No curses, no questions. The boy's lips parted, maybe to explain, maybe to spit, but Silas lifted a finger. Not a hush, not a warning, just something gentler than either. He moved next to the smaller child, picked him up slow, gentle. The little one pressed his face into Silas's collarbone and held on tight. The woman slumped between them. Her head bowed so low her hair hung like wet rope didn't move until he touched her shoulder. Blood matted her dark braid. Or maybe it was dust. Her dress was torn at the hem, her feet bare, her lips cracked. When Silas touched her, her body twitched once, then stilled. He murmured something low, something too soft to be caught by anyone watching. Then he lifted her across his back, as if she weighed no more than the cotton bales the wagons once carried. From behind a veil of lace gloves, Miss Mercy Claggart let out a small gasp. From the chapel steps, Reverend Ezra Loam stepped forward, his Bible in one hand, But he didn't speak. Someone spat. Another cursed low. But Silas didn't look back. He walked steady. One boy cradled in his arms. One woman slung over his shoulder. One boy stumbling behind with fire in his eyes. He passed the tavern where shutters stayed shut on Sundays. Past the blacksmith's, where the anvil hadn't rung true in months, all the way to the sheriff's office, where Tomlin Jex leaned against the doorframe like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You want to tell me what this is?" Reeve Sheriff Jex asked, arms crossed, hand nowhere near his iron. Silas didn't blink. "Found him like this." "That all you got to say?" Silas held the sheriff's gaze. "Ain't right." Then he turned. He set the woman in the wagon bed first, placed her gently atop a folded tarp, covered her with his coat. Then the boys, the older one flinched at the touch, but didn't resist. The little one clung tighter. Sheriff Jex opened his mouth again, closed it. Silas climbed back into the wagon. The wind kicked dust across the sheriff's boots. He drove out, the wheels grinding slow, the weight behind him heavier than feed and flour. They watched him vanish down the road that led past Dry Willow Creek. Toward the hills, no one rode, unless they had to. There, beneath a stand of tired cottonwoods, sat Silas's cabin, a place with a roof that groaned in storm, a stove that burned too hot, and a porch that tilted like a question never asked. But it was quiet. It was his. He carried the woman inside and laid her on the cot. The boys stayed close to the hearth. He gave them water first. The older refused. The younger drank fast, then hiccuped. Silas didn't ask their names. He just brought firewood, lit the stove, heated a cloth, pressed it to the woman's cracked mouth. When she stirred, he pulled back. She didn't wake. He turned, stepped outside, picked up his axe. The rhythm helped. Axe, breath, axe, breath. He didn't let himself think about the bruises, or the ropes, or the look the boy gave him like trust was a word buried too deep to dig out again. Evening fell slow, gold bleeding into ash. Coyotes howled in the distance, far off but not far enough, when he returned inside. The cabin was still. The boys had curled on the braided rug, the older one not sleeping, just watching. The woman's hand had shifted slightly, one finger twitching near the blanket's edge. He sat near the stove, pulled a scrap of wood from the kindling pile, and began to carve. Outside, the sky turned black. The creek whispered to the willows. In the distance, the town lights blinked behind the dust. The cabin held them all like a breath not yet released, somewhere past midnight. The little one woke, crying. Silas stirred only enough to cover him with another blanket, tucking it under his chin like something sacred. The older boy didn't move, but his eyes followed every gesture. The woman slept, if it could be called sleep, and Silas carved. Not a horse, not yet, not a bird, just a shape coming into itself, something being whittled into meaning. By dawn, the fire had dimmed to red and orange coals. Frost glazed the edges of the window, and the wind, the one that had whispered through town and found them bound, was still. Some things, Mercy Claggart said to no one in particular, ain't supposed to be touched, but he done it anyway. Some men speak with bullets, others never speak at all and still change everything. Silas Reeve remembered a voice from long ago, a voice worn down by time and sickness, whispering to him as he crouched beside the hearth. Kindness isn't soft. Boy, it's a decision made quiet, without asking for applause. That voice had belonged to his mother, and by the time the fire took the barn, the house, and part of his face, that lesson was already settled deep in his bones. It was that same silence that wrapped around his cabin now. Days after he carried Leora Brannock and her boys from the freight post outside Ashbrae Crossing. The spring sun had risen weak and pale, like it wasn't yet ready to commit to warmth. The wind had lost its teeth, but still wandered the land in short, rattling sighs. In the half-light of morning, the earth smelled of thaw and ash wood, damp wool and cracked leather. The woman on the cot stirred just once, her fingers twitching against the coarse blanket tucked beneath her chin. Silas didn't look up. He sat in his usual place by the stove, shaping a length of pine into something not yet whole. The knife moved slow, deliberate, every stroke a word unspoken. The fire popped once in the belly of the iron stove. The boys were still by the hearth, one sleeping, the other pretending to. The older one, Thorn, hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. He watched with the distrust of a caged animal, chin tilted, shoulders square, always braced for whatever might come next. Leora opened her eyes just before dawn fully broke. At first, she didn't move. The ache in her spine, the dry pain in her throat, told her plenty. She hadn't been laid on anything soft in days, maybe longer. Her ears caught the creak of the firewood, the scrape of blade on wood. Then her gaze shifted across the room. 2 boys, safe, breathing. She didn't say their names, didn't speak at all. Her body was stiff when she sat up, and the blanket pulled slightly at her legs, where bruises had begun to settle in dull colors beneath her skin. Her lips tasted like copper and ash. A cup of water sat on the stool beside her, clean, untouched, waiting. She drank slow, halfway through. She set the cup down. Her eyes moved to the figure by the stove. He hadn't turned. She stood. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself against the edge of the cot. After a breath, she walked barefoot toward the door, passing the boys without brushing them. The wood under her feet was warm in spots from the stove, cold near the threshold. She stepped just outside, clutching the frame for balance. The sky beyond the porch was gold and bone light rising soft over dry Willow Creek. The trees there leaned into the water like they were listening to it. She remembered that sound from her childhood, water over stone. She hadn't realized how much she missed it. Behind her, the man still carved. "What do you want from us?" Her voice was rough, unused, but steady. Silas didn't answer, not right away. The knife kept moving. "I can leave," she added, her hand tightening around the doorframe. "We don't take charity." He set the carving down on the bench beside him. It was a small bird, not yet sanded, wings unfinished. "I ain't stopping you," he said, his voice gravel low but even. "But you're shaking like a leaf." She looked down at her hands. Damn him, he was right. "I don't take pity," she murmured again. "This ain't pity." "Then what is it?" He finally turned, meeting her eyes in the pale morning light. His face was part shadow, part scar, but his expression was steady, almost unreadable. "It's right." Something in her chest cracked at that. Not loudly, but clean, like frost melting from glass. She didn't answer him, just turned back toward the door. Inside. Thorn was awake, truly awake, watching, when Leora crossed to him. He didn't flinch, but didn't soften either. She sat beside him and reached for Nolan, brushing curls from the boy's damp forehead. "We're safe," she whispered. Thorn didn't nod, didn't speak, just watched the fire. That afternoon, Silas brought in cornbread wrapped in cloth. Leora didn't ask where it came from, didn't ask how he'd managed it in a cabin with only oats, salt, and dried beans visible on the shelf. She tore it into pieces, handed some to each boy, then sat at the table. Her hands shook over the plate. Thorn chewed slow, jaw tight. Nolan devoured his. Silas didn't sit with them. He stayed near the door, looking out at the trees as if listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. When the boys were asleep, curled together on the rug, Leora remained at the table. Her cup had long gone cold, but she held it anyway. Her eyes traced the cracks in the wood. "I'll work for it," she said. "Clean. Cook. You won't get charity from me." Silas walked to the drawer near the stove. He pulled out a pencil stub and a folded piece of paper, flattened it on the table. In slow, firm script, he wrote, "Help where you can. Cook if you want. I won't ask." She stared at the words. "You don't speak much," she said. "I speak when it matters." She folded the paper and held it between her fingers. The next morning, she woke early. Silas was already outside, cutting wood. The sun hadn't broken yet, but the sky was pale at the edges. The cold clung low to the ground, turning dew to ice. She stepped outside and leaned against the post. He moved in rhythm, axe, breath, axe, breath. His coat hung nearby, without it. The scars on his neck and jaw were plain-healed poorly, as if done in haste long ago. Burn scars, twisted and pale, ran from his collar up behind his ear. "What happened?" she asked quietly. He shrugged, swung the axe again. "Fire." A nod. "Someone else's doing." A pause. "Mine." He didn't explain more. Later, while she swept the floor, she found something near the hearth, the carving he'd set down the day before. She picked it up. The bird's wings weren't open. Not yet, but they weren't closed either. She set it on the windowsill. That evening, as the wind came back and rattled the old glass, Thorn moved closer to her without being asked. He didn't speak, just lay beside Nolan, eyes on the flicker of firelight dancing across the ceiling. She reached to touch his hair, then stopped, waited. When he didn't pull away, she continued. Outside, the trees bent in the wind again. Inside, something shifted not loudly, not sharply but real, at sunrise. Thorn burned the carving in the fire, but he didn't stop watching the man who made it. Ashbrae Crossing never cared much for facts, but it remembered stories like they were scripture. There had always been more truth in what people whispered than in what they wrote down, and the people of Ashbrae had long ago learned how to weaponize silence. No gunshot carried as far as a look over the shoulder. No blade cut deeper than a word said sweet and crooked. What they didn't say out loud still made its way to every window, pantry, and prayer bench. Silas Reeve had carried a woman and 2 boys through town, and not one soul had tried to stop him. Not the sheriff, not the pastor, not the women with their parasols tilted just enough to hide a better view. But by the 3rd day, Ashbrae Crossing wasn't watching with quiet shame anymore. It was watching with purpose. Spring deepened. The ground softened. Sap rose in the trees near Dry Willow, and the path into town turned to thick clay that clung to wagon wheels like guilt to memory. Inside Silas's cabin, Leora Brannock had begun to move with more steadiness, though she still walked like someone who expected the ground to shift underfoot. Her cheekbones were no longer as hollow. She no longer jumped when Nolan cried in the night. She cooked simple things: beans, corn griddle cakes, stew that needed too much salt. But she cooked because her hands needed to do something other than tremble. That morning, she washed the boys' clothes in the creek. Silas had left 2 pails and a board beside the water and said nothing about them. She didn't ask. He always seemed to know what was needed, and only offered it when it didn't feel like offering. By the time she returned, the sun was low and gold across the hills. Thorn walked ahead, his arms full of damp fabric. Nolan dawdled, pausing every few steps to pick up a smooth rock or a feather. As they approached the cabin, they found a basket on the porch, carefully arranged, wrapped in linen. The top cloth was stitched with purple thread, a small cross in the center. Inside the basket, candles, soap, a tin of tea, the unmistakable scent of Dory Mercy Claggart. Leora stared at it, lips pressed thin. She picked it up, brought it inside, set it on the table. Thorn stood stiff at the door, arms folded. "Should I throw it out?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the cloth free, lifted a small folded note. "Thought you might be needing some light. Dear, MC." When Silas returned near sundown, a new bundle of firewood over his shoulder, she handed him the note without a word. He read it, then placed it atop the firewood stack and didn't speak. That evening, the peddler came. Jeremiah Clem, a man, built like wind-blown weeds. All bone and grin rolled into Ashbrae on his two-wheeled cart just before dusk. His mule kicked dust with every step. His eyes, sun-bleached and narrow, carried no warmth. He reached the edge of Silas's property before calling out, "Ho there, got a few tins and flour for trade." Leora came to the porch, apron damp with dishwater, hair pinned but loose at the nape. "We don't need anything," she called. "Well now," he said, drawing his horse to a stop. "I heard different." He climbed down, lanky limbs unfolding, from the back of the wagon. He drew a sack of flour and a box of matches. "Word in town is you're settin' in for a while," he said, stepping close to the porch rail. Wasn't sure that's what he had in mind. Leora's back straightened. "I said we don't need anything." He leaned in just a little, eyes flicking over her face like he was appraising a ledger. "Funny thing," he murmured. "Reeve's always been a quiet sort, but I guess quiet men need warm company too, even if it comes with baggage." Thorn appeared behind her, lean, tall for his age, fists already clenched. Jeremiah noticed. He smiled wider. "Well," he said, stepping back. "Didn't mean no offense, just passing along what folks already saying." He tipped an imaginary hat and returned to his cart, the mule pulling it away with a jangle of harness iron and dried laughter trailing behind him. That night, Thorn sat outside alone. He found a crooked stick and a rusted nail and began carving, not with purpose, just with need. The wood splintered more than it shaped. His hands were raw by the time Leora found him, fingers blotched with red. She knelt beside him, didn't touch him. "They don't know us," she said softly. He didn't look up. "They don't have to," he muttered. "I didn't choose what happened." "I know. You believe that?" He paused, trying. Silas didn't say anything when he passed by them, just left a folded cloth and a salve tin near the cabin door, for the cuts, for what couldn't be spoken. In the morning, the cloth was gone, the salve had been used. By midday, Leora was in town. She didn't want to go, but they needed more oats, and Silas was in the hills that day. She walked beside the creek trail with Nolan's small hand in hers. Thorn stayed behind a choice she didn't question. The townsfolk saw her. They didn't greet her. Outside the general store, Miss Claggart stood with her gloved hands folded, a pie balanced on her arm like a burden she was proud to carry. "Well," she said sweetly, "if it isn't Miss Brannock." Leora paused. "It is. You've taken to staying with Mr. Reeve." Leora gave no reply. "I'm not saying it's improper," Mercy added with a polite little smile. "But folks are talking." "They were talking when we were tied to a fence, too," Leora said. Mercy's lips tightened. Some say you ought to be thankful. Leora looked down at Nolan, who watched the exchange with wide eyes. I am, she said, but not to you. She stepped past, bought the oats, walked home. That evening, when Thorn came in from the yard, he found a small wooden carving resting on the windowsill. It wasn't like the first, this one was smoother, sanded clean. The wings were just beginning to lift, not flying, but thinking about it. He didn't touch it, not right away. Later. After the fire dimmed and Nolan slept, Leora watched her older son pick up the carving. He held it in both hands, studied it like it held a truth he didn't know how to speak. Outside, the wind moved gentle through the willow leaves. Inside, Thorn set the carving near his bedroll, turned his face to the wall, and closed his eyes. At dawn, Thorn found a second carving beside his sleeping roll, smaller this time, a bird with its wings just beginning to open. The sky over Dry Willow turned pewter before storms. But what rolled into Ashbrae Crossing that day wasn't weather, it was something owed, from the porch rail of Silas Reeves' cabin. Thorn could see the low swell of the hills bending in shadows. Morning had broken in silence, cool and gray, the clouds sitting low like a ceiling made of lead. The scent of rain hadn't yet reached them, but the feeling had, a tension that coiled low in the belly. He'd felt it before in the moments before his uncle's boot hit the door, or before his mother flinched when the wrong name was spoken. Leora stood by the hearth with a damp rag in her hand, wiping soot from the kettle. Nolan played in the corner with the feather bundle they'd tied together with twine. The peace of that small room, warm, still. Holding breath would not last much longer. Thorn watched the road. He wasn't the only one. Silas was already outside, mending the gate hinge. He hadn't said much that morning, not that he ever did, but there was something in the way his hands moved that told more than words. Steady, sharp, deliberate. He'd checked the rifle by the door before stepping out. Not touched, it just looked. The sound came late in the day. Hooves, fast, hard. Dust bloomed in the distance, pale as bone ash. Thorn narrowed his eyes. His breath caught and held. Leora stepped outside to see what he saw. She froze. No, she whispered. The rider came into view, a bay gelding, legs caked in trail grime, reins swinging loose. The man on its back wore a long brown duster and no hat. His coat flared with each step of the horse, revealing the familiar gait of someone they never expected to see again. A rider crested the hill. Dust coiled behind him. Silas's hand froze mid-swing. Leora's breath hitched. Her hands trembled. Then she whispered a name she hadn't dared say in years. Clay Dandros. Thorn didn't hesitate. He stepped down from the porch, eyes never leaving the oncoming man. His feet found a stick near the chopping block, not long, but solid. He held it tight. Clay dismounted slow, smiling. That old grin, all teeth and borrowed charm, stretched wide across a jaw gone unshaven and mean. May Brannock, he said, using her middle name with a sneer. Ain't you lookin' fed? Leave, she said. He ignored her, looked toward the house, then toward Thorn. That your boy still holding a stick? Thought I taught him better than that. You never taught him anything, Leora replied. Clay laughed once. Sheriff said you were up here playing house with that half-melted ghost. Thought I'd come collect what's mine. I was never yours. I fed you. You broke us. His grin faded. That land was mine. Everything on it. Including you. Then his eyes moved behind her, toward the open cabin door. Get back on your horse, Leora said. Her hands were shaking. She curled them into fists. What are you gonna do? "May you gonna hit me with a pan?" Thorn didn't wait. He lunged. The stick struck Clay square in the side, hard enough to make him stagger. Clay snarled and turned, but before he could reach for the weapon under his coat, another shadow stepped in. Silas. He didn't speak, didn't raise his voice, just closed the distance between them like smoke curling through air. Clay reached for his belt too slow. Silas caught the wrist, twisted. The weapon fell into the dirt with a dull thud. Then Clay was down, one knee in the mud, hand bent at the wrong angle. Silas didn't raise a fist. He leaned in, voice quiet as dry leaves. "I didn't bury the last man who raised a hand to a child," he said, "but I dug the hole." Clay's face twisted, red with fury. Mud streaked his coat. He spat once mostly blood. "I'll be back," he muttered. "No," Silas answered. "You won't." Clay pushed himself to his feet, stumbled to the horse, and climbed up. He didn't look back. The dust followed him as he left. The silence that followed was not relief. Not yet. Leora sank to her knees. Nolan clung to her side. Thorn stood motionless, the broken stick still in his hands, his breath ragged, eyes wild. Silas said nothing. He retrieved the weapon from the ground, a small revolver, barely loaded, and placed it on a high shelf inside the cabin. That night, no one ate. The fire burned too hot. The kettle boiled over. Leora didn't cook. They sat in quiet. Not the soft kind. The kind that filled the space where something broke. Later. She rose from her bed, walked to where Thorn lay beside Nolan. She knelt beside him, reached out, touched his bruised hands. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said, cutting her off. She looked at him. "I've been afraid since the fence," he whispered. "I'm tired of it." She kissed the crown of his head. Silas sat on the porch, his back to them, watching the hills, rifle across his lap now, but resting. The coyotes howled deeper in the hills that night, but they didn't come close. Clay spat blood and staggered backward. He turned once, eyes burning, and said low enough for only Silas to hear, "You ain't seen the last of me." Silas didn't flinch, just whispered, "No, but I'll be ready." And then the wind rose again, harder this time, like it remembered what fear tasted like. A fence can keep danger out, or love from coming in. Depends who hammers the nails. The morning after Clay Dandros left Ashbrae Crossing, broken-jawed and humiliated. The storm that had been pressing against the horizon finally broke. Rain came down in sheets at first, sweeping the dust from Silas Reeves' roof, slapping the loose shutters, pushing against the windows like it had some stake in the place. It washed away the last of Clay's hoofprints, left the land fresh but raw, inside the cabin. The scent of wet earth crept beneath the door. A fire burned low, and the air still held the tang of scorched stew from the night before. No one had eaten much. Fear had sat too heavy in their stomachs. Leora stood at the window with her hand resting on the frame, watching water trace trails down the glass. Behind her, the boys slept close, tangled under the quilt. Silas was gone, though his coat remained on the hook, heavy and damp from the earlier rain. She assumed he'd gone to check the property, or the traps by the edge of the creek. She didn't know why, but she reached for the carving left on the sill, the one Thorn hadn't yet claimed. Its wings were not fully open, but no longer hesitant either. It reminded her of her own breath not quite full, not quite free, but moving. By noon, the sky had cleared enough for the mud to set in thick. Silas returned with a plank of pine slung over one shoulder, and a hammer in hand. He said nothing as he walked past the porch where Leora was sweeping pooled leaves. He didn't glance her way, Just moved to the shed and began sorting wood. "What are you building?" she asked. He paused, nodded once at the front gate. She looked. The rails had started to lean with the weight of time and weather. One of the hinges creaked. Broken. Beyond it lay the trail Clay had come up, and might again. "You building a new one?" she asked. Silas didn't answer, just held up a second plank and measured it with a quiet eye. "I'll help," she said. That afternoon, Thorne joined them. He didn't say a word, just brought nails in his pocket and the same hammer he'd once used to hang the kettle hook over the hearth. Silas watched him set a brace, then nodded. Leora sanded the edges of the boards with a cloth until her arms ached. She liked the rhythm of it, the quiet, the knowledge that this time, the thing they were building had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with staying. From inside the cabin. Nolan watched with his hands pressed against the glass, eyes wide and full of questions, when the new gate finally stood, not fancy, not smooth, but strong and clean. Silas stepped back. "It opens both ways," he said. Leora met his eyes. "Good. So nobody feels trapped." He nodded once, then returned to the shed to put away the tools. Later, as dusk settled and the sky turned lavender at the edges, Reverend Ezra Loam made his way up the path. Leora saw him first from the edge of the porch. His coat was clean, but worn thin, his collar frayed. He walked with the kind of careful tread a man used when stepping into a place not sure it would welcome him. "Miss Brannock," he said, doffing his hat. "I was hoping for a word." Silas was on the other side of the cabin, splitting kindling. Leora stepped forward. "Go on." Then. The Reverend looked to her, then glanced past her shoulder at the door. "Folks in town are wondering. I imagine they are. There's concern," he said, "that things aren't settled." Leora folded her arms. "Nothing in Ashbrae's ever been settled." "Reverend." He sighed. "Silas Reeves a quiet man, hard to read, but people notice things, like carrying children and battered women through town while everyone else watched." He winced. "That's not what I meant. It's what happened." The Reverend nodded slowly. "I don't mean to offend. I only ask because there are whispers about vows, about appearances." She waited. "And there's word Clay might come back," he added more quietly. "He's not the sort to forget a bruise or walk away from what he thinks he owns." Behind them, Silas appeared, wiping his hands on a cloth. He said nothing, but his presence alone changed the air. "Do you intend to marry her?" the Reverend asked plainly. Silas looked at Leora. She spoke before he could. "He already made us safe," she said. "That's more than any ring's ever done." Reverend Loam hesitated, then nodded. "Grace is still grace. Don't let your silence cost you the good thing you've started here." He tipped his hat and walked off, boots leaving shallow prints in the soft earth. That night, Leora cleaned the kitchen until the floor shone with oil and cloth. Nolan helped fold linens. Thorne fixed the latch on the back window. Silas worked in the barn, stitching an old saddle strap back to life. When she finally sat down near the fire, the boys already dozing behind her, she stared into the flames. "I never wanted a man's name to save me," she said aloud, unsure if Silas had come back in. "I know," came his voice from the shadows. She turned. He was just inside the door, watching the fire too. "Then don't take mine," he said. His voice held no sting, just truth. She lowered her gaze, not because it hurt, but because it didn't, because it made sense, because he saw her. When she rose, she passed him in the doorway and reached into the cupboard. She pulled out the tin she used for biscuits. The next morning, the tin sat on the porch rail, still warm. 3 biscuits inside, wrapped in a clean cloth, at sunrise. Thorn placed his hand on the half-built gate and said, to no one in particular, "It opens both ways." Good. Some warmth doesn't burn, it lingers, even when the fire's out. When Leora Brannock first arrived at Silas Reeves' cabin, she hadn't known how long she'd stay, or if she'd even last the first night without bolting into the dark with her boys in her arms. She hadn't expected the porch boards to stop creaking beneath her feet when she walked them barefoot in the morning, or the fire to feel less like survival and more like comfort. But something had shifted in the week since Clay Dandros had ridden off bloodied and small beneath the weight of his own pride. It wasn't loud. That change, it didn't ring out like church bells or burst like spring thunder. It came soft, and it stayed. Frost had come early that year. A white lace edged the fence rails and hung heavy on the porch where the tin of biscuits had waited the morning before. Now, as dawn cracked the sky pale, Silas sat by the stove sipping weak coffee, his hands wrapped around the tin mug like it held more than heat. He could hear Leora stirring before she appeared. Her steps were softer now, measured. She didn't wake like prey anymore. She woke like someone who belonged in a place. She joined him with her own cup, pulling her shawl close. The fire cracked and sighed behind them, a quiet reminder that something inside these walls still lived. "I keep thinking about that night," she said. "So do I." Neither said which night. They didn't have to. Outside. Thorn was already up, tending the coop that hadn't existed a month ago. He'd built it with Silas's help, using scrap wood from the back shed. The door still stuck on one hinge, but it stood, and it kept the cold out. Nolan sat nearby, wrapped in a quilt, tracing shapes into the frost with one finger. The cabin had changed. So had its people. Leora washed with intention now, not just to scrub dirt, but to clear the air of old shadows. Thorn ate without glancing at the door every 10 seconds. Nolan hummed again. Silas carved more often. Horses, a fence rail, even a small rocking chair he didn't speak about. But she saw it tucked in the corner near the barn, too small for a man, too rough to sell. She didn't ask who it was for. One evening, Thorn returned from the creek with a stack of boards over one shoulder and a red streak of blood down his forearm. "What happened?" Leora asked, standing fast. He shrugged, caught it on a nail. "Let me—" "I got it," he said, brushing past. She followed him into the cabin, found him washing the scrape roughly, the blood swirling into the wash basin. Thorn flinched as the cold water touched raw skin. "They say things," he muttered. She stopped. "Who?" "Boys in town. Said you were a kept woman, that Silas only takes us in 'cause nobody else would." Her voice caught in her throat. "What did you do?" she asked softly. "I hit one of 'em. Not hard. He bled a little." She walked to him, reached for his head, then paused. He looked at her. She leaned forward and kissed the crown of his hair. "Then we'll call it even." That night. Silas said nothing about the scrape, but in the morning. Thorn found a tin of salve beside his bedding, thicker than the one before, with a sprig of mint tucked inside, like a small kindness no one mentioned. A few days passed. Then Jeremiah Clem returned. He came early, wagon loaded heavier than usual. His mule moved slower, its hooves scuffing the trail like it didn't want to make the trip. Leora saw him from the porch. "We need flour and matches," she said as he climbed down. Jeremiah grinned, wolf-like. "Thought you'd be gone by now." "We're not. Rumor said you were passing through." He stepped closer. Guess a quiet man makes easy company for a woman with weight. Before Leora could answer, a voice rang out from behind her. You leave now. Jeremiah paused, turned. Thorn stood on the porch step, fists clenched. Not a boy's stance anymore, but something older, something earned. Jeremiah sneered. Big words for a... He stopped. Silas was standing just inside the barn door. Arms folded. No rifle. No threat. Just presence. Jeremiah hesitated, then stepped back. No offense meant, he said. You meant every word, Silas replied. Now go. The peddler turned, climbing into his cart, muttering under his breath. He didn't look back. Thorn didn't move until the wagon was out of sight. Then slowly he relaxed under Silas's gaze. That evening, Leora chopped wood faster than usual, her jaw tight, her cheeks red from the cold. She didn't speak until Silas stepped beside her, stacking logs in neat rows. You could have hit him, she said. I've hit men before. Doesn't change what they are. But it changed something, just standing there like that. Silas looked over at her. Then, quietly, in him, in you, in all of us. She set the axe down, breathless not from the work, but from something rising in her chest. I don't know how to raise boys, he said. You don't have to, she answered. Just don't leave. He blinked. The cold stung between them. I wasn't going to. She reached for the next log. They worked side by side after that. Wordless, but not empty. The kind of silence that only came after everything necessary had already been said. That night. She left another tin of warm biscuits on the porch rail. In the morning, there was a third carving on the windowsill, bigger than the others, heavier in the wings. It was facing home. The gate creaked gently in the wind and didn't close. It didn't need to. Out where the wind still hums through fence wire and the sky bleeds slow into dusk. There's a silence that remembers more than any man dares speak. And maybe that's all that needs saying now. Some stories don't end with thunder or bullets, just with the steady creak of a gate left open on purpose and the warmth of a fire that no longer needs tending. And as the wind folds back across the hills near Dry Willow Creek, the names don't echo, but the choices do. You might not see wildflowers growing out there, but they bloom all the same from between broken boards, around the base of old hitching posts, in the shadows of cabins where someone once believed a scarred man's silence was safer than 1,000 promises. There's a shape to this kind of ending, not clean or bright, but shaped like breath held too long and finally let go. Shaped like a hand reaching across the years to lay a carved wooden bird in another's palm, without a word, without needing one. You'll remember the smell of pine sap on gloves too big for her hands, the dust caught in the curls of a child's hair, the sound of an axe splitting not just wood, but time, memory, and fear. You'll hear the scrape of boot leather on porch planks as a boy stepped between a lie and his mother, not because he was sure, but because someone showed him what honor looked like in silence. That gate they built together didn't lock it welcomed. It warned, and it forgave. And the rocking chair Silas carved and left in the barn, the one he never finished, maybe it still waits. Maybe it never needed finishing. The frost came and went, but the biscuits stayed warm longer than they should have. And maybe that's the point. Some things don't keep because they last, but because someone offered them without expecting anything back. And that plain iron ring, left in a tin without a name or vow, wasn't a promise, it was a place to begin again. No trumpet, no preacher, just the quiet knowing of two people who saw each other and chose not to turn away. The truth is, justice doesn't always gallop in on a white horse, and sometimes the only law that matters is what a man's willing to stand for when the rest of the town's too quiet. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all, but stay. Carve, feed, guard, hold, and mean it. Leora Brannock was never anyone's to own, and Thorne was never a boy too broken to fight, and Nolan, well, maybe he'll grow up humming, never remembering what fear really felt like, and Silas Reeve half burned, half blessed, whole only in the ways that mattered he never needed saving, just somewhere to put all that he carried. Out here, the coyotes still call at night, and the wind still kicks up dust over old trails. But there's a patch of land just beyond town where kindness took root in silence. And the town, for all its judgment and slowness, learned to watch with better eyes. If you remember anything from this story, let it be that honor can be buried, but not erased, and justice, even when it limps, still arrives. Let it be that a woman left for nothing gave everything, not loudly, but completely, and that the truth doesn't need to be believed by everyone, just kept alive by someone who won't let go. The next time you hear the wind slipping between fence posts or find a carved bird tucked in a drawer you don't remember opening, ask yourself what still matters. Who still matters? If this story found you in the late hours by lamplight or through an old speaker while the fire dies, and if it left something behind, even the shape of a breath, I ask you to leave a mark of your own. If you still believe in quiet redemption, in silent strength, in the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout, go on and press the number 1 key below. Mark it, not for me, but for her, for him, for the boys, for what was built and never claimed, but always earned. And if your boots are still clean, maybe it's time to get dust on them. Subscribe to Western Story Chronicles, and I'll be waiting with the next story under the lantern, near the old post, where the wind always knows first.